born in a palace, died in quiet obscurity. Born a Prussian prince, died a man lost to his time. This is the tragic story of Prince Joachim Albert, cousin of the German emperor. How did a man born into power, a talented composer, end up so lonely? His journey down is a story of a broken marriage, a ruined fortune, and an artist's soul crushed by the times. To comprehend the tragedy of Prince Joachim Albert's fall, we must first appreciate the dizzying, almost unimaginable heights from which he fell. The world he was born into, the German Empire of 1876, was a universe built on the bedrock of tradition, hierarchy, duty, and the unshakable belief in the divine right of kings. At the absolute apex of this world, more a force of nature than a mere family, stood the House of Hohenzollern. This was a dynasty that had, through centuries of cunning, ambition, and ruthless military efficiency, clawed its way up from being minor Swabian counts to the Margraves of Brandenburg, the kings of Prussia, and finally, the emperors of a united Germany. Their power and prestige were second to none in continental Europe. The family was a vast, sprawling, and complex organism, a web of interconnected branches and lines, all revolving around a single, blazing sun. At the very center was the direct imperial line, the reigning Kaiser Wilhelm I, a man who had led Prussia to victory over Austria and France. His son, Crown Prince Friedrich, a thoughtful liberal married to Queen Victoria's eldest daughter, and his grandson, the boy who would become Kaiser Wilhelm II, and who would come to define the era in all its glory and hubris. This was the core of the dynasty, the public face of the German Empire. But surrounding this central trio were the cadet branches. These were the descendants of younger sons of previous kings of Prussia, dozens of other princes, dukes, and cousins, all bearing the prestigious Hohenzollern name and the style of royal highness. They were all immensely wealthy, all possessed of vast estates, and all expected to live their lives according to the family's rigid, unbending code. Their lives were dedicated to service, hereditary positions in the upper house of the Prussian parliament, high-ranking commands in the army, and key ceremonial roles at court. They were the essential supporting cast to the grand imperial drama, their existence a constant reinforcement of the dynasty's power and permanence. Prince Joachim Albert was born into one of the most prominent of these side branches. His father was Prince Albrecht of Prussia, known as Albert, a nephew of the reigning Kaiser Wilhelm I. Prince Albert was the archetypal Prussian prince, a career soldier who had dedicated his life to the army, serving with distinction as a cavalry general in the wars of German unification. He was a man of immense stature and traditional values, but his career took a unique political turn that would profoundly shape his son's upbringing. In 1884, the ducal line of a small but historically important state, the Duchy of Brunswick, died out. According to the laws of succession, the throne should have passed to the head of the House of Hanover, Ernst August, the Duke of Cumberland. But there was a problem. The Duke of Cumberland was the son of King George V of Hanover, whose kingdom had been conquered and annexed by Prussia during the Austro-Prussian War of 1866. The Hanoverians were sworn enemies of the Hohenzollerns and had never accepted the new German Empire. Berlin was unwilling to allow an openly hostile prince to take the throne of a German federal state. So, in a controversial political maneuver, the Duke of Cumberland was declared ineligible to rule, and the government of Brunswick, under immense pressure from Chancellor Bismarck, invited the loyal Prussian Prince Albert to rule the duchy as its regent. This meant that Prince Joachim Albert spent much of his youth in a strange dual reality. He was a Prince of Prussia, a member of the imperial house in Berlin, attending grand ceremonies and family events at the heart of the empire. But his home was the ducal palace in Brunswick, where his father was the acting head of state of a territory that was, in a sense, being held in trust against its rightful, but exiled, rulers. He grew up surrounded by the complex machinery of government, court ceremony, and the simmering political resentments of the Guelph-Hohenzollern feud. He was raised with the unshakable day-to-day evidence of his family's immense power and the permanence of their position. It was a belief that would be utterly shattered within his lifetime, leaving him with no foundation upon which to build a new life. This rigid world of the parade ground and the palace, governed by his father's unique political role, was designed to mold the prince into another pillar of the Hohenzollern state. But while the path of a Prussian prince was rigidly defined by military and dynastic duty, the inner world of young Joachim Albert was colored by a passion entirely at odds with the stoic traditions of his house. Beneath the uniform, a different identity was forming, not of a soldier, but of an artist. And it was this secret, sensitive soul that would define the central conflict of his life. The path laid out for Prince Joachim Albert was as straight and as rigid as a Prussian parade ground. Born into the heart of the ruling dynasty, his childhood was a meticulously planned progression of tutors, military commissioning, and social grooming, all designed to produce another flawless pillar of the Hohenzollern state. He was raised in the opulent but stern atmosphere of his father's regency in Brunswick and in the grand palaces of Berlin. He duly followed the prescribed course, entering the army and preparing for a life of quiet, respectable duty in the service of the crown. On the surface, he was the model of a minor German royal, handsome, charming in a reserved way, and a popular figure in the exclusive high society of pre-war Berlin. He fulfilled his military obligations with competence and was, to all outward appearances, a perfect product of his environment. He possessed a deep, genuine, and truly remarkable talent for music. This was not the casual, dilettante hobby of a bored aristocrat. It was a serious, consuming passion, a fundamental part of his being that stood in stark contrast to the world he was forced to inhabit. And it is in this hidden musical side of his life that we can find the key to understanding the real man and the seeds of his later tragedy. To appreciate the seriousness of the prince's talent, we must first understand that the Berlin of his youth was, arguably, the musical capital of the world. It was a city of fierce artistic rivalries and unparalleled excellence. The Berlin Philharmonic had become one of the world's greatest orchestras. The city's opera houses and concert halls were legendary, attracting the most famous singers, instrumentalists, and composers from across the globe. This was the city where titans like Johannes Brahms were revered, and where the bold modernistic works of Richard Strauss were causing sensations. For a young, musically gifted aristocrat, it was a dazzling and inspiring environment. But for a prince of Prussia, a direct member of the ruling house, to pursue music as anything more than a polite pastime was highly eccentric. The Hohenzollern dynasty prized the hard, masculine virtues of the soldier and the statesman. The arts were seen as a pleasant decoration for society, but the actual creation of art was often viewed with a certain suspicion as an emotional, undisciplined, and slightly effeminate pursuit, ill-suited for a future military commander. Yet Joachim Albert's talent was so undeniable that even the rigid conventions of his family had to make room for it. He was permitted to undertake a formal and rigorous musical education, studying with some of the most celebrated masters of his time. His principal teacher in composition and music theory was none other than the legendary Joseph Joachim. It is difficult to overstate what this meant. Joseph Joachim was not some courtly music tutor. He was a giant of 19th century music. A violin virtuoso of international renown, he was also a composer, conductor, and the longtime director of the Berlin Royal Academy of Music. He was most famously a close friend and collaborator of Johannes Brahms. It was for Joseph Joachim that Brahms wrote his magnificent violin concerto. For the young prince to be accepted as a serious student by a master of this caliber is a testament to his own profound ability. This was the equivalent of a modern amateur musician being personally mentored by John Williams or Hans Zimmer. It proved that his passion was backed by genuine, professional-level skill. Under the guidance of masters like Joachim, the prince honed his craft. He developed a deep understanding of harmony, counterpoint, and orchestration, and he began to compose. His body of work reveals the fascinating duality of his character, the tension between the soldier and the artist. On one hand, he composed military marches. This was the expected genre for a Prussian prince, the patriotic, rhythmic music of the parade ground. But his marches were noted for being particularly melodic and sophisticated, a cut above the standard fare. On the other hand, and far more revealingly, he composed numerous lieder or art songs for voice and piano. This was the intimate, emotional heart of German Romanticism, the genre of Schubert and Schumann, dedicated to exploring the deepest feelings of love, loss, and the beauty of nature. The fact that he was drawn to this deeply personal and expressive form of music speaks volumes about his inner world. It has often been written that his most ambitious work was a full-length ballet titled Ein Maientraum, a May dream. But in a twist that is perhaps the most symbolic of his entire life, there is no credible historical evidence, no surviving score, no performance program that this work ever existed. This phantom of a masterpiece serves as the perfect allegory for his life, the unfulfilled potential of an artist, a dream that vanished before it could ever take shape. The title suggests a romantic, perhaps fantastical story, a world of dreams and magic, far removed from the cold, hard reality of the Prussian barracks. His music was his escape, the realm where the sensitive soul could flourish, free from the constraints of his uniform. His compositions were reportedly well regarded, with some even being performed publicly to positive reviews, a rare achievement for a royal amateur. This passion, however, must have created a profound internal conflict. How was this artistic side of his personality viewed by his family? By his stern, military father? By his famously bombastic and hypermasculine cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm II? While his talent was tolerated, it would have marked him as different. In a family of soldiers, the composer is an oddity. He would have lived a life of constant code switching, moving between two utterly different worlds, the rigid, formal, and emotionally repressed world of the Prussian court and the army, and the inner world of music, a world of deep feeling, romanticism, and creative freedom. This duality is perhaps the most crucial element in understanding the man he would become. He was disciplined, yet sensitive, a public figure who craved private expression, an officer trained for command, who was perhaps better suited to the quiet solitude of the composer's study. He understood and performed his duty, but his heart was elsewhere. He was a man divided against himself. And as he entered his 30s, this divided man was about to undertake the most important duty of all for a prince of his standing. He was to marry and produce an heir, a decision that would ultimately prove to be the most disastrous of his life. For all his inner artistic life, the external requirements of his station were non-negotiable. His next great duty was to secure the family line through a suitable marriage. It was a duty he would perform, entering into a union that represented the height of imperial pomp, but which would ultimately become a source of profound personal misery, just as the world itself prepared to descend into the chaos of war. In the intricate tapestry of European royal history, each thread represents a life, an alliance, a destiny. But not every thread gleams with the golden sheen of power and happiness. Some, on closer inspection, are colored with the gray of duty, of quiet sacrifice, and of private tragedy obscured by public splendor. Our story today unravels one such thread, a marriage brokered not on the foundation of love, but on the geopolitical chessboard of an empire at the zenith of its power, yet unknowingly hurtling toward the abyss of its own destruction. We will delve into the world of Prince Joachim Albert of Prussia and Princess Marie Auguste of Anhalt, a couple whose union was one of the last great spectacles of the old order. But behind the gilded palace doors, a very different story unfolded, a tale of distance, of mismatched souls, and of a war that would not only devastate nations but would shatter their private world. To understand the marriage of Joachim Albert, we must first understand the cold, complex machinery of the royal marriage market in the early 20th century. This was no place for romantic hearts. It was a stock exchange where the currencies were bloodlines, territories, and military alliances. For a prince of the House of Hohenzollern, one of Europe's most powerful and militaristic dynasties, marriage was not a personal choice. It was an act of state. The process was governed by a set of unwritten but ironclad rules. The foremost principle was Ebenbürtigkeit, an equality of birth. A bride for a Prussian prince had to come from a reigning or formerly reigning royal family. A wealthy countess or the daughter of a powerful industrialist, no matter how beautiful or intelligent, simply would not do. The blood had to be pure, undiluted by commoners. Next came religion. The German Empire, with Prussia at its heart, was a Protestant power. A prospective bride had to be of the correct Lutheran faith. A Catholic princess, no matter how powerful her kingdom, would have introduced unacceptable political and social complications. And finally, most importantly, was politics. The marriage had to strengthen Prussia's position within the German Empire and across Europe. An alliance with a significant German duchy could reinforce internal unity, tightening bonds that might otherwise grow frayed. Diplomats, court ministers, and the Kaiser himself would weigh each potential candidate like pieces on a grand chessboard. Lists were drawn up, discreet inquiries were made, and portraits were exchanged between courts. For the man at the center of all this, Prince Joachim Albert, his personal feelings were barely a footnote. He was an asset of the state, and his marriage was an instrument of state policy. And so, after lengthy deliberations and strategic calculations, the dynastic machine made its selection. The choice fell not on a bride from a major empire like Russia or Britain, but from a small yet respected German duchy, Anhalt. The name put forward was Princess Marie Auguste. Her full name, Marie Auguste Antoinette Friederike Alexandra Hilda Louise, was a history lesson in itself, each name a tribute to a royal ancestor. She was the daughter of Eduard, the soon-to-be Duke of Anhalt, a land ruled by the ancient House of Ascania, one of the oldest dynasties in Germany. To comprehend the culture shock Marie Auguste was about to face, we must picture the difference between her world and that of Joachim Albert. Anhalt, with its capital at Dessau, was a provincial, peaceful court. Life there moved at a slower, more intimate pace. It was a world of manicured gardens, chamber music concerts, and close family ties. Marie Auguste grew up in this sheltered environment. At 19, she was known for her striking beauty and a vivacious, perhaps slightly impetuous spirit. She was a product of the Belle Époque, an era of optimism, of cascading gowns and swirling waltzes. She likely dreamed of the love and romance described in the novels she may have read in secret. Then one day the news arrived. She had been chosen to be the wife of a prince of Prussia, a man 14 years her senior, whom she had never met. We can only imagine the whirlwind of emotions in the young woman's heart. On one hand, it was an unimaginable honor. The House of Hohenzollern was the pinnacle of German society. Berlin was the epicenter of power, culture, and excitement. It was a chance to escape the quietude of Dessau and step onto the world stage. But on the other hand, it must have been a terrifying prospect. She would have to leave her family, her friends, everything she had ever known. She was to marry a total stranger, a stern Prussian soldier, with a reputation for being introspective and melancholic. Would he like her? Could she like him? Could she adapt to the rigid formality and iron discipline of the Berlin court, a world away from the warmth of Anhalt? On paper, it was a perfect union. It solidified ties between Prussia and another sovereign German state, but on paper does not account for the complexities of the human heart. For Joachim Albert, the romantic artist trapped in a soldier's uniform, accepting a bride chosen for him must have been a profound act of resignation, the final admission that his life was not his own. For Marie Auguste, the vibrant young woman, it was a leap into the dark, a gamble with her entire future. Despite their private fears and doubts, duty prevailed. The engagement was announced, and the machinery was set in motion for one of the most splendid royal weddings Berlin had ever seen. The summer of 1909. Berlin was at the apex of its imperial power. Its grand boulevards bustled with horse-drawn carriages and the first sputtering automobiles. Its imposing neoclassical buildings were monuments to the ambition of a young, powerful nation. And into this world, the wedding of Prince Joachim Albert and Princess Marie Auguste was not merely a social event. It was a political statement. It was a performance of the strength, stability, and permanence of the German Reich. The event took place at Bellevue Palace, a graceful neoclassical palace overlooking the Spree River. For several days, it became the center of the European royal universe. Kings, princes, and dukes from across the German states and from kingdoms far beyond descended on Berlin. They were a great, sprawling family of cousins, many of whom, just a few years later, would be mortal enemies on the battlefield. But in 1909, the illusion of European solidarity still held. Picture the scene: the magnificent state coaches, escorted by cavalry in gleaming helmets, processing through the Brandenburg Gate. The crowds of Berliners waving flags, cheering as they caught a glimpse of royalty. Inside the palace, the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, candle wax, and history. Polished marble floors reflected the glittering light of thousands of candles in massive crystal chandeliers. Kaiser Wilhelm II, in his resplendent field marshal's uniform, presided over the affair. His presence gave the event its national significance. Marie Auguste, undoubtedly overwhelmed, processed in a white silk bridal gown, her long veil held by attendants. Joachim Albert, in his dark blue dress uniform, awaited her, his face a mask of solemn duty, perhaps hiding a storm of emotion. He was performing his part. The ceremony was a blend of solemn religious rites and military pomp. It was followed by a lavish banquet and a ball that lasted late into the night. Royal couples danced Strauss waltzes, diamonds flashing at their throats and medals clinking on their chests. From the outside, it was a fairy tale come to life. It was the culmination of Joachim Albert's life as a prince of a reigning house, the zenith of a world that seemed built on an unshakable foundation of tradition and power. But it was an illusion. That magnificent, stable world was, in fact, a house of cards, and the winds of change, nationalism, industrialization, simmering political tensions were already beginning to blow. This wedding, in all its splendor, was not the dawn of a new era, but the last waltz of a dying one. The new couple, the center of all this attention, smiled and played their parts, unaware that their world had only 5 short years left before it would crumble into ash. After the excitement of the wedding faded and the last of the royal guests departed Berlin, Joachim Albert and Marie Auguste were left to face the reality of their life together. They settled into a luxurious residence in Berlin, surrounded by opulence and attended by a legion of servants. They had everything money could buy, but they lacked the one thing that truly mattered: a connection. Their daily life was a relentless cycle of duty, court ceremonies where they had to stand for hours, smiling politely, state dinners where conversation was dominated by politics and stiff pleasantries, military reviews where Joachim Albert, in his role as an officer, had to display his loyalty to the Kaiser and the army. They were a handsome couple, their images frequently appearing on postcards and in society magazines. To the German public, they were a symbol of royal stability and domestic bliss. But behind the closed doors of their residence, a much colder reality existed. The differences in their age and temperament, which had seemed manageable on paper, became an unbridgeable chasm in daily life. Joachim Albert, in his 30s, was a man set in his ways. He was a quiet, introspective person who found his joy and solace in his own world, in his library, among his dusty books, or at his piano where he could express the emotions he could not put into words. He likely yearned for an understanding companion, someone with whom he could share a comfortable silence. Marie Auguste, by contrast, was a teenager thrust into an alien world. Her energy and vivacity, which were admired in Anhalt, may have been seen as frivolous or undignified at the stern Prussian court. She was surrounded by luxury, but she likely felt more alone than ever before. She craved excitement, balls, witty conversation, and laughter, all things that seemed to be in short supply in her life with her melancholic husband. We can imagine their typical evenings. After a silent, perfectly served dinner, he would retreat to his study or music room. She would sit alone in the opulent drawing room, perhaps flipping through a Parisian fashion magazine, feeling like a bird in a gilded cage. They shared a roof, but they inhabited separate worlds. They were two strangers bound together by a contract, playing the part of husband and wife for the public, but with no real intimacy or affection in private. This incompatibility was no one's fault. It was the product of a system that treated human beings like chess pieces. The cracks in their marriage began to form almost immediately. They were small fissures, invisible to the outside world, but they grew deeper and wider with time. And soon, a historical earthquake would shatter their fragile union completely. 7 years passed. 7 years of strained public smiles and quiet private evenings. In 1916, in the midst of the most brutal war Europe had ever known, Marie Auguste gave birth to a son. He was given a long string of royal names: Karl Franz Joseph Wilhelm Friedrich Eduard Paul. The birth of an heir, in normal circumstances, would have been an occasion of immense joy. It secured the continuation of the line. It could have been a bridge to mend a fractured marriage, but the circumstances were anything but normal. This child was not born into the glittering world of 1909. The Berlin of 1916 was a city at war. The initial euphoria was long gone, replaced by weariness and deprivation. That winter became known as the turnip winter because of severe food shortages. Long lists of the fallen were posted on public buildings. Women dressed in the black of mourning were a common sight on the streets. Karl Franz was born into a world of anxiety and grief. His father, Joachim Albert, was not present for his birth. He was somewhere on the vast Eastern Front, hundreds of miles away. The news of his son's birth likely reached him via a cold telegram. We can picture him standing in a muddy field office, reading the words, and feeling a complex mixture of pride and profound sadness. Pride that he had a son, that he had done his duty, but sadness for the world into which his son had been born, a world of violence and death. For Marie Auguste, motherhood in wartime must have been an isolating experience. She would have faced the anxieties and responsibilities of raising an infant largely alone, while her husband was in harm's way. The birth of Karl Franz did not mend their marriage. If anything, it likely highlighted the distance between them. The child was one more testament to their duty, another link in their contract, but not the product of love. He was a prince of an empire fighting for its very existence, an heir to an increasingly uncertain future. When the first shots of the Great War rang out in the hot summer of 1914, they signaled the abrupt end of the Belle Epoque. For Prince Joachim Albert, there was never any question of his role. He was not just a composer or an aristocrat. He was a senior officer in the Prussian army, the very heart of the German military machine. Duty was paramount. At 38, he was a seasoned soldier. He immediately donned his gray field uniform, said goodbye to the world of concert halls and handwritten musical scores, and left for the front. The transition must have been jarring. One day he was discussing the structure of a symphony. The next he was studying strategic maps, planning the movement of tens of thousands of men, while his more famous cousins, the sons of the Kaiser, were given symbolic and highly publicized commands on the Western Front. Fate sent Joachim Albert to a different theater of war. He was dispatched to the Eastern Front, a conflict that was vast, brutal, and often overshadowed by the trench warfare in France. The Eastern Front was a different beast entirely. It was not a static war of attrition with armies facing each other across a narrow no-man's land. Because of the immense geographical scale stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, it was a war of movement. Great armies maneuvered across vast plains, engaging in epic battles of encirclement like the one at Tannenberg, where the Germans won a spectacular victory against the Russians early in the war. The weather was as cruel an enemy as the Russian army. Summers brought scorching heat, dust, and swarms of disease-carrying flies. Winters brought the legendary Russian cold, a cold that could freeze the oil in a rifle and kill a soldier at his post. As a staff officer attached to a corps command, Joachim Albert was not a frontline infantryman. His work took place behind the lines in field headquarters. He was responsible for logistics, ensuring that hundreds of thousands of men had ammunition, food, and medical care. He studied reconnaissance reports, analyzed enemy weaknesses, and helped draw up plans of attack. It was an intellectual job, but it was far from safe. Headquarters were frequently shelled, and he was constantly exposed to the stress and immense challenges of coordinating a war on such a massive front. And for a man with the soul of an artist, the experience must have been a relentless nightmare. We must try to imagine the psychological devastation the war wrought upon a man like Joachim Albert. He was a person who had spent his life in search of beauty and harmony. His music, like his ballet Ein Maientraum, was an attempt to capture delicate emotions, fleeting moments of romance. Now, his world was the absolute antithesis of all that. It was a world of chaos, ugliness, and industrial-scale violence. Consider the sounds. A composer has a finely tuned ear, capable of discerning the subtlest nuances of an orchestra. Now, that ear was tortured by a symphony of hell. The ceaseless roar of heavy artillery, a sound that shook the earth and vibrated in one's chest, the shriek of incoming shells, the sharp, stuttering chatter of machine guns, and worst of all, the human sounds, the screams of the wounded, the moans of the dying. For Joachim Albert, every explosion was a violent negation of harmony. Every death was a horrific, dissonant note in the symphony of life. Consider the sights. An artist who sought beauty in nature and art was now forced to witness the most appalling scenes. Villages burned to the ground with only skeletal chimneys left standing. Fields that once grew wheat were now a quagmire of mud, barbed wire, and the corpses of men and horses. He witnessed the suffering of civilian populations caught between the armies, desperate refugees fleeing their homes. As a staff officer, he was subjected to a different kind of horror, the horror of abstraction. He didn't see the face of every soldier he sent into battle, but he saw the numbers on a map, the arrows representing divisions moving toward their possible deaths. He read the casualty reports, the cold statistics that masked thousands of individual tragedies. This detachment was perhaps even more terrifying, turning war into a monstrous calculation, a machine of which he was a cog. He performed his duty with the quiet competence that was his hallmark. He was awarded the Iron Cross, a testament to his service. But the cost was immense. The war deepened the melancholy inherent in his nature, twisting it into something darker and more permanent. It created an unbridgeable chasm between the man he was before the war and the man he had become. The world of courtly ceremony, of ivory piano keys, and of May dreams must have seemed like it belonged to another lifetime, an unbelievable dream he had once lived. The artist's soul had been grievously wounded, perhaps beyond repair. By 1917, Germany's immense effort on the Eastern Front began to pay off. The Russian Empire, rotten from within by corruption, incompetence, and social unrest, collapsed. Revolutions toppled Tsar Nicholas II. The Russian army, weary of war and agitated by the Bolsheviks, disintegrated. Soldiers deserted en masse, simply dropping their weapons and walking home. For German soldiers like Joachim Albert, it was an astonishing spectacle. The colossal enemy they had been fighting for over 3 years had simply vanished before their eyes. In early 1918, Russia's new Bolshevik government, desperate to exit the war, signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. It was a spectacularly advantageous peace treaty for Germany. Russia was forced to give up vast territories, including Poland, Ukraine, and the Baltic states. On the Eastern Front, Germany had won. Prince Joachim Albert and his comrades had won their war. There must have been a sense of relief, even elation. Finally, the sacrifices seemed to have been worth it. But this victory was a mirage, a false dawn before the darkest night. While they were celebrating their success in the East, the situation in the West had become desperate. The War of the Trenches had bled Germany white. America's entry into the war in 1917 had given the Allies a nearly limitless supply of men and material. The German High Command knew they had one last chance. They decided on a final, desperate gamble to transfer hundreds of thousands of battle-hardened troops from the Eastern Front to the West to launch one last massive offensive, known as the 1918 Spring Offensive. They hoped to break the Allied lines and win the war before the Americans could arrive in force. Joachim Albert and his unit were part of this great transfer. As the troop trains rumbled westward, across a war-weary Germany, there must have been a sense of grim hope. They were the victors from the East, sent to deliver the decisive blow in the West. They had no idea they were traveling from a phantom victory to a total defeat. They also had no idea that the home front they had left behind was itself on the verge of collapse. The deprivations, the war weariness, and the political discontent were simmering just below the surface of German society. The same revolutionary fervor that had toppled the Tsar in Russia was now taking root in their own homeland. Prince Joachim Albert had survived the war against the Tsar. He had witnessed the fall of an empire. But as he returned west, he was about to witness the collapse of his entire world, not by enemy bullets, but from the weight of its own contradictions and failures. His greatest battle was still ahead, and it would be a fight not for territory, but for survival in a world that had been changed forever. The great external war was over, and Prince Joachim Albert was a survivor. But the collapse of the German Empire created a new internal battlefield for him. The rigid social structures that had held his unhappy marriage together and guaranteed his financial security were now gone. In the chaotic, unforgiving new world of the Weimar Republic, where his titles were meaningless and his skills obsolete, his personal life would begin to unravel with a speed and brutality that rivaled the chaos on the streets of Berlin. Prince Joachim Albert of Prussia returned from the front in late 1918, a victor in a lost war. He had been part of the army that had defeated Russia, but he came home to a nation that had been defeated from within. The Germany he returned to was not the one he had left in 1914. The empire was gone. The Kaiser, his cousin and commander-in-chief, had abdicated and fled into exile in the Netherlands. A fragile, chaotic, and bitterly divided republic had been declared. The psychological shock for men like Joachim Albert is almost impossible for us to imagine. His entire identity, his very name, was predicated on the existence of the monarchy. The revolution did not just remove his family from power, it erased the entire social and spiritual universe they had inhabited. On November 14th, 1918, the new Republican government formally abolished all hereditary noble and royal titles. He was no longer His Royal Highness Prince Joachim Albert of Prussia. Legally, he was now just a private citizen named Joachim Albert Prince von Preußen. Prince von Preußen, Prince of Prussia, was no longer a title, it was merely a surname, a ghostly echo of a vanished world. This legal change was symbolic of a much more brutal reality. The vast wealth of the Hohenzollern dynasty, which had been built over centuries, was confiscated by the new state. The sprawling royal estates, the palaces, and the generous state allowances known as appanages, which had provided the princes with their immense incomes, were gone overnight. The very foundation of his privileged existence had been dynamited. The artist prince, the decorated officer, was now, for the first time in his 42 years, a man without a country, without a title, and most terrifyingly, without an income. He was utterly unprepared for the world that came next. The collapse of the empire was swiftly followed by the collapse of his personal life. The unhappy marriage to Princess Marie Auguste, a union born of dynastic duty, had been held together by the rigid structures of the imperial court. Without the formal roles, the endless ceremonies, and the immense social pressure to maintain a united front, the deep cracks in their relationship fractured completely. In the chaotic, free-wheeling atmosphere of 1920s Berlin, where old rules no longer applied, their marriage disintegrated. They separated, and what followed was an inevitable divorce. In the freer atmosphere of the Weimar Republic, where old rules no longer applied, a royal divorce was a rare and noteworthy event, and it was certainly covered by the press. However, It was not the multi-year sensationalist scandal of popular retelling. Instead, it was the bitter and public end to the last pillar of Joachim Albert's old world. The details that emerge painted a picture of a profoundly broken union. He, the older, melancholic introvert; she, the young, high-spirited princess, now free from the constraints of court life and eager to embrace the decadent freedoms of the roaring 20s in Berlin. The divorce was finalized, and the last pillar of Joachim Albert's old life was kicked away. He was now not only a prince without a throne, but a husband without a wife, and for long stretches a father separated from his son. The story of his ex-wife is a parallel tragedy that highlights the moral and financial desperation of the déclassé aristocracy in this new world. After divorcing Joachim Albert, Marie Auguste's life became a whirlwind of scandal. She remarried a minor baron, a union that quickly ended in another divorce. Desperate for money and status, she became infamous for a particularly bizarre and sad enterprise. She began adopting paying customers. For a hefty fee, she would legally adopt adult men, bestowing upon them the courtesy title of Prince von Anhalt, which they could then use for social climbing. It was a pathetic scheme, selling off the last vestiges of her royal heritage to the highest bidder. Her life, like her first husband's, spiraled downwards into a sad haze of debt and obscurity, a cautionary tale of a princess utterly lost in the modern world. While his marriage was collapsing in a public spectacle, Joachim Albert's finances were disintegrating in a private, slow-motion catastrophe. The initial loss of his royal income had been a severe blow, but the final knockout punch was delivered by the great hyperinflation of 1923. It is almost impossible to comprehend the scale of this economic meltdown. As the German government printed money with reckless abandon to pay its war debts, the currency became utterly worthless. The numbers are astronomical, surreal. In January 1923, $1 US was worth about 18,000 German marks. By November of that same year, $1 was worth 4.2 trillion marks. A loaf of bread that cost a few hundred marks in the morning could cost several million by the afternoon. For anyone who had savings, a pension, or any assets held in cash, it was an apocalypse. Any remaining fortune that Joachim Albert possessed, any bonds or cash reserves, were turned into literal dust. The wealth of centuries was wiped out in a matter of months. He was now truly broke. He reportedly tried with a kind of aristocratic helplessness to make his own way. He was a man in his late 40s, with a life experience that was utterly useless in the commercial world of the Weimar Republic. He had been trained to command a regiment, to attend a state dinner, to discuss music and art, not to run a business or balance a budget. He is said to have entered into various business ventures, likely with other down-on-their-luck aristocrats, but these invariably failed. He was a fish out of water, a creature of the 19th century struggling to survive in the brutal, fast-paced 20th. His decline was not one of abject poverty, as legend would have it. After the loss of his royal fortune, he still received a modest financial allowance from the Hohenzollern family's administration. He lived in a private apartment in Berlin, not wandering between boarding houses. But Prince Joachim Albert's true tragedy was far deeper than poverty. It was one of invisibility. From a prince at the center of imperial affairs, he became a ghost in his own city. The greatest pain was not the lack of money, but the lack of a meaningful existence. He was socially dead long before he was physically gone. While his more prominent cousins, the sons of the exiled Kaiser, still possessed considerable wealth and were actively engaged in right-wing politics, plotting for a restoration, Joachim Albert seems to have simply drifted. He was not a political player. He was a casualty, a man who had lost the energy to fight. The fire of the artist and the discipline of the soldier had been extinguished, replaced by the quiet, gnawing anxiety of poverty. He was a man completely unmoored from the anchors of his life. His title, his country, his family, and his fortune were all gone. The sensitive artist who had once composed a ballet called A May Dream was now living a bleak November reality, with no end in sight. The man who emerged from the wreckage of the Weimar years was a ghost of his former self, a prince only in name, stripped of his family, his fortune, and his purpose. As Germany once again hardened itself, transforming under the iron will of the Nazi regime and marching towards another great war, he was left behind by history. The final chapter of his life would not be one of struggle or defiance, but of quiet, profound obscurity, a slow fade into the anonymity he had once been born to rule over, as he lived out his last days in a city that no longer remembered him. By the 1930s, he had faded into near total anonymity. Prince Joachim Albert of Prussia, once a fixture of imperial high society, now drifted through the streets of a city that was no longer his. Berlin in the 1930s was a city of febrile energy and simmering terror, the new capital of Adolf Hitler's Third Reich. It was a place of grand, megalomaniacal architectural plans and secret whispered arrests. It was a city gearing up for war. And in the midst of this historical maelstrom, the forgotten prince lived a life of almost total obscurity. He had hit rock bottom. Divorced, estranged from his son Karl Franz, and with no source of income, he was now completely dependent on the charity of others. He moved from one modest rented room to another in the city's bourgeois boarding houses, or pensionen. These were respectable but anonymous places, havens for widows, minor officials, and others who had seen better days. For a man born in a palace, it was the ultimate humiliation. His once famous cousins, the sons of the exiled Kaiser, still held a certain cachet in this new Germany. The Nazis, in their early years, had courted them for their symbolic value, and though that relationship had cooled, they were still prominent, wealthy figures. But for a minor, impoverished, and politically irrelevant prince like Joachim Albert, the new regime had no use whatsoever. He was simply an anachronism, a relic of a past that Hitler was seeking to both co-opt and destroy. He was, for all intents and purposes, invisible. One must wonder what happened to the artist's soul in these final desperate years. What happened to the composer who had studied with masters and written a romantic ballet? Did he still find solace at the piano trying to capture his immense sorrow in melody? Or had the relentless, grinding hardship of his life silenced the music within him forever? It is perhaps the most tragic thought of all that the one true, authentic part of his being, his artistic gift, was a luxury he could no longer afford. The sensitive soul that had chafed under the rigidity of the Prussian uniform was now likely crushed by the simple, brutal weight of poverty and loneliness. He was a man with nothing left. His family was broken, his fortune gone, his country transformed into something monstrous, and his art, perhaps, had died within him. In the autumn of 1939, the world's attention was fixed on the battlefields of Poland. The German blitzkrieg had crushed a nation in a matter of weeks, and the continent was now sliding inexorably into another great war. In Berlin, the mood was a tense mixture of triumph and trepidation. It was amidst this global drama that the final quiet act of Prince Joachim Albert's life played out. His health, worn down by years of stress and deprivation, finally gave way. In his small rented room, he passed away. It was October 18th, 1939. He was 63 years old. The man who had been born into a world of infinite possibility died in a state of almost complete anonymity. The final, poignant testament to his forgotten status lies in the contrast between his death and another which had occurred in the Hohenzollern family just 1 month prior. In September 1939, when his distant cousin, the 23-year-old Prince Oscar Jr., was killed in Poland, his funeral had been a massive national event, an outpouring of monarchist sympathy that had shaken the Nazi regime. There was no such spectacle for Prince Joachim Albert. His death was barely noted in the newspapers. He was given a simple private funeral, arranged and paid for by the Hohenzollern family's central administration, a final act of dynastic duty for a fallen member. He was buried quietly, without pomp or ceremony, in the family section of a cemetery in Potsdam, the city of his ancestors' glory. There were no grieving crowds, no political repercussions. One prince's death had been a historical event. The other's was a quiet family matter, quickly dealt with and forgotten. Looking back on the tragic arc of Prince Joachim Albert's life, it is easy to see him as a pure victim of history, a man crushed by the immense impersonal forces of war, revolution, and economic collapse. And indeed, he was. The world he was raised for, with all its certainties and privileges, was annihilated in 1918, a cataclysm that few of his class were equipped to survive. However, to absolve him of all agency is to miss the more complex and human part of the story. His personality, the very artistic sensitivity that makes him a sympathetic figure, also seems to have made him uniquely unsuited for the challenges he faced. Unlike some of his more pragmatic or politically ruthless relatives, he lacked the skills or perhaps the will to navigate the new, unforgiving world of the Weimar Republic. His inability to manage his finances, his failure to find a new purpose, and his retreat into obscurity speak to a man who was, perhaps, broken by the collapse of his world rather than spurred to action by it. His disastrous marriage and public divorce, while a product of the era's new social freedoms, also point to personal incompatibilities and perhaps poor judgment. Ultimately, his story is not a simple case of a man destroyed by history. It is the more subtle tragedy of a man whose specific character and temperament were a perfect mismatch for the brutal historical moment in which he found himself. He was the wrong man at the wrong time. The life of Prince Joachim Albert of Prussia is not a story of great deeds, but its significance lies in that very fact. He is a powerful and poignant symbol of the forgotten casualties of great historical upheavals. History, by its nature, remembers the victors, the villains, and the major players. It remembers the Kaiser who lost his throne, and the leaders who built the new republic. But it tends to forget the thousands of other individuals, like Joachim Albert, whose lives were not central to the grand narrative, but were nonetheless completely and utterly shattered by it. His story is a chilling lesson in the absolute fragility of privilege. It demonstrates that a life begun at the highest possible peak of society, surrounded by wealth and power that seemed as permanent as the stars, can be completely undone. It reminds us that the structures that seem so unshakable, empires, dynasties, and the social orders they create, are often just brittle cages. When they break, those who have never known a life outside them are often the most helpless. Finally, his story serves as a timeless allegory for the conflict between our inner nature and our prescribed social role. He was an artist and a composer, a man of feeling and romanticism, born into a culture that demanded he be a stoic and a soldier. In a gentler, more forgiving world, he might have been remembered as a minor but respected composer. Instead, he is remembered, if at all, as a failed prince. His life is a quiet testament to the immense human cost of forcing a soul into a shape it was never meant to hold. In the end, what is left of Prince Joachim Albert of Prussia? There are no grand monuments to his name, no lasting political legacy. His only son, Karl Franz, eventually settled in America, living a quiet, private life, the royal lineage fading into the fabric of a new world. The cadet branch of the family, like the prince himself, had dissolved into obscurity. His story is a quiet tragedy of decline, a poignant and melancholic counterpoint to the thunderous, violent history of his time. It is the story of a man who outlived his world, a prince who became a pauper, a public figure who died in the most private and anonymous of ways. He is the forgotten Hohenzollern, his life a stark reminder that for every famous name that echoes through the halls of history, there are countless others who are simply swept away by its unforgiving tide, their stories lost to the silence. Perhaps the most fitting epitaph for him lies not in the bare records of his birth and death, but in the lost, unheard scores of the music he once composed. His true legacy was never his royal title, but his melodies, the final quiet testament to a sensitive soul trapped in a brutal age, a forgotten melody from a world that is no more.